Well, tēnā koutou katoa, no America ho no te tematanga, ko te taita toku maunga, ko waitaki toku awa, ko otatahi toku kainga inai nei, e roia toku tunga mahi o Perryfield Lawyers, ko Steven Moe toku ingoa, no reira nā mihi kia koutou katoa. Hey, it's great to have such a large number of people joining us today to listen and learn and ask questions about startups, and with a particular focus on capital raising. I'm Steven Moe. I'm a partner at Perryfield Lawyers, and I'm joined by two colleagues today. So do you want to say who you are?
Hi, my name is Yang Su. I'm a senior solicitor here at Perryfield Lawyers under Steven Moe's team.
And I'm Sophie. I'm a solicitor here at Parryfield Lawyers as well, and work with Steven helping startups.
Yeah, so our firm, we have 4 offices and we've got about 80 people in our firm. We do a lot of work with startups, and we're based in Otatahi, Christchurch, which means we've helped many startups down here, but also across the country. And what we really want to do is make the law as accessible as possible and as easy to understand as possible, because being an entrepreneur is hard enough, right? Having to deal with the legalese that comes from documents, it's just an extra layer that we hope to make simpler for you. So that was the origin of this session. We're planning in 2024, hard to believe it's around the corner, but we're planning to run more of these as well. And we'd love to do them on topics that are going to be relevant and helpful for you. So I think in the last maybe year and a half, it's been a strange time for startups, right? But we've helped probably 7 or 8 of them with their capital raisings, you know, going for between $1 and $3 million and getting all of the documents right to be able to really kickstart that initiative. Because the thing about a startup is you might have the best idea in the world and you might have the ability to implement it, but at some point, you're going to need the oil in the machine, which is the money, the funds, to be able to make the machine work right. So what we're going to do is run through, if you signed up, you saw the list of the topics. We're going to kind of have a pick and mix as we go. And just as the mood takes us, we're going to go and dive in on a topic that we think will be of interest to you. And I think I'll finish up with this intro shortly, and then Sophie, I might get you to talk about companies, some of the key documents, just to set the baseline. Yeah, just before we do that though, I always like to have some sort of a picture, like something that illustrates beyond the legal technical stuff, what are we actually doing? And my picture today is actually this. I'm holding up an apple for those of you who can't see it. An apple is full of goodness and nutrition, isn't it? It's a healthy type of thing to eat. But the true potential isn't the nutrients for our bodies. It's the seed that's inside of the apple. And if you plant the seed, and if you give it the right nutrients, if you give it the right water, warmth, if you have the soil, the conditions need to be right for this apple to grow apple trees. And so I view that as similar in startup world. You might have the great idea, the seed of a great idea. You have a company, but you need to have the extra layers of support that will allow your idea, your seed, to flourish. And if it does, then it's actually going to grow. It's going to produce many apples itself. And it's the same with a startup. So what we want to do is give you some hints and tips about what are those key things that you need to be aware of when you're in startup mode, and then focusing in on capital raising. So Sophie, could I hand over to you? Oh, the other thing, like I said before we started recording, the chat function is there. Please use it. We would love to have as many difficult questions as you can throw at us. We want the easy ones are fine too, but we would love to hear from you what's on your mind as we're going through. So Sophie might say something, it might spark a question. Just put it in the chat. We'll either address it as we go or we'll deal with it at the end. So Sophie, just maybe guide us through, like, companies are really common as a startup vehicle. what are the criteria? What are the documents that these people might need if they're setting up a company structure?
Absolutely. Thanks, Stephen. So companies, like Stephen said, they're a really common vehicle used by startups. So a company is its own legal person. It's incorporated with Companies Office, and it's owned by shareholders and run by directors. So some of the key documents that a company would need, there's a constitution, which is a public-facing document. So that's available on the Companies Office register for the whole world to see. And that sort of sets out the day-to-day governance of a company, as well as a bit on the relationship between the directors and the shareholders. Along with the constitution, working alongside that is a shareholders agreement. Now, this is different to the constitution in the sense that it's a private document. So that's just between the shareholders, and it sort of sets out in more detail the relationship between the directors and the shareholders as well. So you've got a constitution, which is public facing, a shareholders agreement, which is a private document, and then a couple of other documents as well, if you're looking to capital raise, that you might come across, include a terms sheet, which sort of, it's not necessarily, it's what happens before a binding agreement, before you get investors on board, and sort of sets out the details of the investors and the types of shares that you might be giving to them, and sets out some of those details. And then there's also a subscription agreement, which is used when a company wants to issue shares to investors, and that one's binding. So those are some of the key documents.
Yeah, that's great. And I think in New Zealand, there's actually some relatively standard documents that people use when it comes to startups. So if you're looking around, there are actually examples. So the Angel Association, they produce some example of documents like shareholders agreements and constitution. Sophie, you're in this chat as well, right? So Sophie's multitasking. She's not only helping deliver, she's got her laptop as well. So in the chat, we're going to put things that we're talking about as well, just to give it really accessible. So drop in the Angel Association one. The key thing is that all these documents will be negotiated, and they'll be specific for your situation. So be wary of just downloading a document, adding a name at the top, and thinking that's all, because your situation is probably going to be different to the next startup. For example, who should be a director of your startup? Who should have the right to appoint a director? Oftentimes that's tied in with a percentage that's owned. So you might have a certain amount of shares, and therefore you can appoint a director. That's going to be quite unique for your situation. So just be conscious of that. So Yang, why don't we have a look or have a think, because when it comes to vesting and how do we incentivize founders, this is an area that we get a lot of questions about, and a lot of people wondering, like, how do we actually keep people involved and engaged in our startup? So Yang's going to run through some thoughts around what that involves.
Yeah, I'm just gonna just before that, we got a great question from Auntie Sarah. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. What is the role of an information memorandum in the preparation for raising capital? So an IM is typically what we call a disclosure statement. So an IM basically sets out, it can be as detailed as necessary, or it can be quite high level. It sets out information about the potential for investment, because when you're raising funds, typically, if it's not raising debt, if you're raising equity financing, which just means that you're purchasing shares in the company, there are laws. There's a law in New Zealand called the FMCA, Financial Markets Conduct Act, that basically require any legal person that is selling shares, for example, or even selling debt, to provide enough information so that the person that is buying it has enough information so that they're not basically going into it blindly. Now, having said that, in the startup space, right, what we tend to see is that because the companies are so small and the investments tend to be on the lower side, that we try to find an exception to the statutory requirement for a disclosure statement, and those are contained in Schedule 1 of the FMCA. And the most common ones that we will see will be something like wholesale or a small offer. Now, all of these are just terms that you will have no idea about at this moment, but then in our website, we have a rundown of some of these exceptions and how, in order to raise money, you want to sort of have the investor fit under this exception so that you don't have to give out an information memorandum, or what we call here in New Zealand a PDS, a product disclosure statement. Okay? All right. So that was a great question. So let's just move on a little bit to how vesting works. So what is vesting? Vesting is basically a method to basically keep founders engaged. And the way that this works is, when you, as a founder, you create a company, you typically will issue all the shares to the founders. The founders are the only shareholders. Now, when an investor comes in, what they want to make sure is that if they're putting money into the company, they want the people that are critical to the success of the company to continue to invest their time and effort into the company. And that's why they will put in something called a vesting clause. And the way that a vesting clause means is, the way that it works is it's typically written down in the shareholders agreement. And that's why shareholders agreement, the negotiation aspect of it is so important, because it sets out the rights amongst all the shareholders. And the founders, basically, they will own their shares, but the shares are then vested through a time period. And typically what we see is we see a 4-year vesting period. That's something that the New Zealand market is very comfortable with, sometimes almost with a 1-year cliff. And what that means is that nothing vests for the first year, and then 1/4 of it vests after that 1 year. That's the cliff. Why do we have vesting provisions? A vesting provision basically allows the investor to say, well, if you're going to leave after 2 years after I invested in this company, well, half of your shares remain unvested, right? And I want to be able, or the company wants to be able to buy those shares back at a very nominal value, for example, $1. And that just means that the investor gets comfort knowing that if I've invested $1 million into this company, that, you know, the founder is not just going to give up and go, oh, this was too hard, I'm done with it, and I'm just going to step out. No, you have skin in the game as well. Although the shares belong to you, right? The shares, if you go to company's office, you will see all of the shares still belong to the founder. But contractually, under the shareholders agreement, some of those shares, until they're vested, are unvested, and therefore you stand a chance of losing those shares if you leave prior to the 4-year period, for example. Now, because you still own the shares, even the unvested shares, you still have the right to vote those shares, okay? So it doesn't mean that if your shares are invested that they don't exist. They still exist. They're still under your name. You still own them. It's just that you have the risk of losing them for very nominal value. So you can still get, you can still vote those shares. So those shares you still can exercise power to vote those shares, and you can still get dividends if dividends come out from the company, based on the shares that even if they are unvested, but they're owned by you, okay? Now, another way that investors are trying to ensure that founders stay with a company is they will put in provisions like bad leaver provisions. So again, this is very similar to the unvested aspect of it, but once again, if you leave in bad leaver circumstances, basically, let's say you resign, or you're basically fired for cause or something like that, then it might trigger, again, under the shareholders agreement, certain rights for the investors or for the company to basically be able to purchase your shares, even your vested shares, the shares that you have vested, for a fair market value. Okay, so even though your shares are vested, in this time period you left the company, well, we don't want you to basically continue with this company and to still have a say as a shareholder. So we're going to have a provision within the shareholders agreement that allows us to buy those back. Typically, these are bought back at fair market value. So it's a little bit more of an assurance that whatever it is that you put in, you still get some value for it. And then finally, there might be some restrictions on transfers. So within the shareholders agreements, the investors might say, okay, well, for the first 2 years, you don't even think about transferring your shares, right? You can't even transfer it out to your spouse. You can't transfer it to a family trust. it depends on what the negotiated position is, but the key idea is to make sure that the founder is locked in personally to the continued success of the company. Okay.
That's awesome. Thank you. And thanks for the comments that are coming through. Yeah, we're putting in the links in the chat, so I'm glad that you're appreciating the links. So that's a really good overview of that sort of vesting and how to keep people engaged. One bit of advice for those of you who are starting out is just take time to make sure that the people who are joining you on the journey are actually going to be as committed as you are to your idea. Because I've seen this happen multiple times where the founder, which I'm assuming is those of you on the call, you have the belief, let's be honest, it's blood, sweat, and tears the first couple months and years. You're willing to put in the hours, the time, and then you meet someone at a catch-up, or ecosystem event, and they're like, oh, well, I can handle your marketing. I'm great. I can do your website. I've got connections. Would you transfer 15% or 25%? And then I will do the work for you. Just be cautious who you get in the boat, who you get in the waka rowing with you into the future. Don't just get the first person who seems like they're going to be the answer to your problems. Because the point is, once you've issued shares, it's actually quite hard to call them back or to force someone to sell. So if someone is joined you and you're issued shares to them on the basis that they're going to provide some help, and then they're maybe spending 20 minutes a week on this, it's super frustrating for you as the founder because you get diluted. So just a word of caution there. Coming back, I think Sophie's dropped in the chat, the capital raising key issues for founders guide. So we wrote this, obviously we're giving you as much as we can in this short little video session here, but do have a look at that because it's got a lot of resources, about 20 pages. So it's not like a massive textbook, but it will give you a lot of the key things that we think that you need to know. And I just wanted to pick up on something that Yang was explaining about who you get money from. So these exemptions that were mentioned, the key thing is, well, the government is worried that you're going to go knock on grandma's door and say, wouldn't you like to invest in my startup? I'm not giving you any information, but it's going to be a sure thing. That's the situation they're trying to avoid. And to do that, they then blanket cover everything unless you fit in these exemptions. So the wholesale investor exemption that Yang was mentioning, and I find it easiest to explain this is wholesale is code for wealthy person. So it's the wealthy people. It's the people who, if they're wealthy, in theory, they know what they're doing, right? Like they're making a lot of money. They have invested in other things. Their accountant, their lawyer is willing to sign a certificate that says, yeah, they know what they're doing. So that's a category that you can go to. But when you're going to them, you can have little wordings in your documents that say this is only an offer to qualified investors, to wholesale investors. I think we put the wording in that capital raising guide, but we also wrote an article. Actually, do you want to find the article on, you've already put it up? Okay, you're too fast. It's on raising money from family and friends, and the wording is in that as well. So just keep that in mind. The other exemption, which we often will be suggesting you might want to use, is called the small offers one. So small offers is getting less than 2 million, which will be many startups, from less than 20 people in less than a 12-month period. So 12 months, 20 people, less than 2 million. That counts as a small offer. And so you don't have to provide as much information in that situation. But it is only for those select people that you've approached. It's not a blanket, advertisement and stuff saying everybody is welcome. Very limited. So I just wanted to be clear on that because I see people getting confused quite often about like, well, where can I get my money and do it safely? Yeah. The other thing I wanted to mention is this family and friends point. Hopefully these are practical tips, but I've just seen some founders come to grief because they reach out to their aunt and their uncle, their cousin, their sibling, their parents, and they get investment. And that's fine. I'm not trying to totally discourage that. But what I would say is that startups are inherently risky. And the situation coming up in, it's hard to believe, it's less than a month, you're going to be sitting at the Christmas table and someone's going to say, can you pass the potatoes, please? And if your startup didn't work out and they invested part of their life savings, it's a really difficult conversation and it's hard to recover. And in my mind, relationship is more important than money and startups. So just, it's a word of caution. Be careful when you're getting money. If people have their eyes open, they totally understand what they're doing. I understand, and it's necessary sometimes, but I have seen some founders regret that because actually it's burned a bridge of a relationship that ultimately was more important than getting that 5,000 or that 10,000. So just a word of caution, a word of warning, maybe. The other thing that I wanted to touch on, and we'll go to the questions in a minute. We're keeping this session relatively short and sweet because we don't want to overload you with too much content. A lot of that's in the guides. But I did want to touch on other entity types. So we've talked about companies and how that's an option, but there are other options as well. So I want to touch on that. Make sure to drop some more questions into the chat because we'll turn to that in a second, and one of us will have a go at answering those. But when it comes to structure options, what I just one of the things that we've become quite known for as a law firm is helping what we call purpose-driven entrepreneurs or impact-driven entrepreneurs, which I think increasingly is most entrepreneurs. In other words, it's not just about the profits, the shareholders, the money. It's also about the impact, the purpose of our company, or the problem that we're trying to solve. So we help a lot of people with this. And the thing I would say on that is, Sophie rightly pointed out, most companies have a constitution, but a constitution is not actually legally required. I think it's a deficiency in the legal situation, because I think we should require companies to have constitutions. The reason I say this is for charities, we require them to have a founding document. We require them to say what their purpose is, what their mission is, but we don't require that of companies. So one thing I'd encourage all of you on the call to consider, at least consider it, can you articulate your mission and the good that you want to do in the world and actually embed it in your constitution? The reason I think that's important is that it sets you apart. It will also ensure that the investors who come to look at your company will actually understand what you're about beyond the financial return. And sometimes saying no to investment can be a healthy thing. Just the first person with a checkbook doesn't necessarily mean that you should jump in and say, yep, come in and be a shareholder. So having your purpose articulated in your constitution is one way to make sure that the world knows what you're about. So I mentioned we do a lot with impact and purpose-driven entrepreneurs. I'm really proud of the fact that we are just finishing working on a constitution. The opening line says, this company exists to serve Mother Earth. So just let that sink in for a second. This company exists to serve Mother Earth. That's quite different from most company constitutions, which are dealing with quorum and directors and shareholders and things like that. So it's a way that you can actually frame what type of entity you are and what you want to do, the good that you want to have done in the world. Yeah, I think you can touch on that in a second. The other thing is that when we're talking about legal structures is don't necessarily assume that a company is the right structure for you. The reason that I mention that is that if you're passionate about the purpose and the impact that you want to see in the world, then for some founders, it's actually appropriate to consider the funding that's available for philanthropic efforts or charitable efforts. So it might be appropriate to think about, well, maybe instead of a company, we should become a charitable thing. If we're reducing poverty, advancing education, or something along those lines. So probably for this group, it's not going to be relevant, but I did want to mention it. Some of you should actually look at how can we have the most impact and then choose your legal structure rather than automatically assuming, oh, we have to be a company. There are other options. So it's good to keep in mind. The other thing we've been doing a lot of is hybrid organizations. So for-profit company working alongside a for-purpose organization like a charitable trust or something like that. So that's possible. You just have to have separation between the two governance structures. And we do that a lot. The point is that there might be funding available for a charitable endeavor that advances your purpose and funding available for a for-purpose company, which is about having an impact in the world through investment. So just bear those in mind. Yeah. Now we're going to jump over to the questions in a second, but I also thought it would be good. Yang's just going to cover a few other things which will probably be on your radar at some point so that you know what they are, because there's other ways of getting funding in. So yeah, why don't we run through this? So this is SAFEs, convertible notes, and loans. Tell us more.
So like I said, in the fundraising ecosystem, there's two major categories for being able to raise funds. One is equity and one is debt. In equity, basically, you are signing up for the upside of the company. So you are basically getting part ownership of the company. That means that if the company grows explosively, then you also get that explosive growth upside. However, the risk of that is if the company does not work out very well, then you also take the risk of losing all the value of the investment that you put in. The other one is debt. Now, debt is everybody is fairly familiar with it. It's like it's mortgage, basically. Like if you're buying a house, you're borrowing money. So in the startup ecosystem, it's typically a little bit more difficult to raise debt financing, to borrow money. And the reason why is because when you're borrowing money, you're basically making a commitment to repay that money in a certain period of time and giving interest to the lender. That means that the lender actually doesn't take any risk about the status of your company other than insolvency. But for example, if the company is doing fantastically well, as the lender, you're not going to get extra money because you lent the company money. You're still just only going to get the interest rate that you've negotiated for. However, in the startup ecosystem, it's difficult to raise lending because you don't really have much of an economic history that you can point to for the lender to get enough comfort to go, I'm willing to lend to this company, right? This company is a startup for the first 6 months to a year, maybe making absolutely zero amount of profits. And so where are they going to get the money to repay the loan? That's why for semi-developed company or companies that are on the cusp of basically becoming profitable or having some sort of revenue generation, there are blended type of instruments that are called convertible notes. And a convertible note is basically an investor saying, fine, I will lend this company money, but I want the option to be able to change my debt into equity at a pre-agreed conversion price. So for example, I will lend $1 million, and then for each $1,000, I want to be able to get 1 share if I so choose to. And that for the investor basically can be the best of both worlds, in that if the company is doing very poorly, then they go, okay, well, I'm just going to keep it as debt. Or if the company is doing fantastically well, then I'm going to change it into equity, and I'm going to basically ride the upside of the company as I see it. That's an option that can exist for fundraising, and that's called a convertible note. And one of the most popular convertible notes in the startup ecosystem is what we call a SAFE. SAFE was created by Y Combinator, in the US, and it's basically a standard form of a convertible note agreement that allows investors to invest on a convertible note basis. Okay. We have a question.
We do have a question, which is awesome. And Sophie, do you want to have a go at having an answer of that one? And then we can all chip in.
Sounds good. So we've had a great question on whether or not question is, can a company have a charity as a subsidiary, or do they have to be completely separate entities? This is a really good question. So generally, there are lots of different forms that a charity can take, a lot of different legal structures that can apply for charitable status. A company can be a charity, which is it's a fun fact. It just needs to have the relevant provisions in its constitution. And there's also charitable trusts and incorporated societies. Generally, I mean, a company could have a charity as its subsidiary. It could be that the charity is set up as a company and then owned by the other company. It could be that it's a charitable trust which works alongside the company, and that charitable trust might even have shares in the company. So there's a lot of different ways to structure it. Anything's possible when it comes to legal structures, isn't it, Stephen?
Mm-hmm.
But one thing to be clear on is the flow of funds between the charity and the company as well, because the charity exists to advance the charitable purposes, whereas the company doesn't necessarily do that. So that's something that you need to be clear on.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, no, that's excellent. That's exactly right. The only thing I would add is that every situation is unique. So it's really hard to give advice about do this or do that, but we have helped both types of people. So number one, we've helped charities that come to us and say, we think there's a business in what we do, and we've helped them set up businesses. We've also helped big businesses who've come to us and said, actually, there's aspects of what we do which is charitable, and therefore, can you help us? And we've helped them set up charities. So it is possible to have more of an interweaving. I think this is like in a way, it's a paradigm shift of thinking. Instead of focusing on the entity type that you are, focus on the good that you want to do in the world, and then work back from that. So if you, for example, I'm making up an example, but it's an actual real one. If you want to help ex-prisoners get jobs, right? You might think initially, oh, well, that's a charity. That's going to be about education and things. But what if you set up a business that employed ex-prisoners? So therefore, you were achieving your purpose and your impact through your business model. Some people call this social enterprise as well. So we're kind of mixing a little bit here. I wrote a little book on social enterprise, which I think we put in the chat, but if not, we can. So that's kind of challenging the paradigm of thought that to do good has to be charitable, to make money is always a business. You can actually have a blending. We have a client who's a building company, and they came to us and said, we want to do some good in the world as well. And, you know, the building itself is inherently good, like people need houses to live in, but we help set up a charity, which now is focusing on social housing and poverty reduction and things. So I guess all I'm trying to do is open your mind to the fact that maybe there's different ways of structuring things than you might have realized was possible. Yeah. So back to our session, our topic on capital raising and fundraising. Have we got any other questions in there at the moment? No? Well, we're going to finish off soon. So if any of you do have questions, now's your moment. Does anybody want to come off of mute and like ask the question on video? You're welcome to. I'll pause for 5 seconds, and then you can do that if you would like. That's fine. See, we've answered all your questions. That's amazing. All right. We've got a question in the chat. All right. Do you want to read that one out?
Absolutely. I'm interested to hear if you have any thoughts on non-voting shares and crowdfunding for equity.
Oh, great. That's a good question. So crowdfunding, I've done this. So yeah, I've done this before. I think crowdfunding is a really good option if you have a consumer-focused product. The reason is that you get ambassadors for your product. So by crowdfunding, just a step back. So Pledge Me is a great example of this. They are a way that you can actually go out to the market and you can say, hey, would you like to buy a part of our company, a little percentage, but you will own a bit of what we do. And the beauty of it is that by getting, let's say you had a certain amount of your company that you put up for crowdfunding, 10% or 15% or something. So every person is getting a little bit of it. But what if you had 750 people who then own a little bit of your company? All of a sudden, you have 750 people who are your ambassadors out in the marketplace. And the next time, particularly for consumer type goods, hey, what type of beer should we have tonight? Well, I own a little piece of that company. Let's order that. You know what I mean? It's like there's actually a marketing side to it that I think is a really positive thing. Of course, with any structure, there's going to be extra things to think about. So having 750 stakeholders, just as an example, that's a lot of people to keep informed and a lot of people to take on the journey with you, and they're shareholders as well. So, but I think for some startups, it's definitely something that they should consider and be looking into. What was the second part of that question?
Non-voting shares.
Oh, non-voting shares. Yeah, I mean, this is the beauty of company structures, is you can actually have different types of shares. You can actually make it very specific for your situation. So you might have a class of shares, like A-class shares, B-class shares, C-class shares, and they might have different rights. And yeah, some of them might have not having voting rights, but they would get dividends. So it's a way, I guess, to allow people to be involved while not necessarily giving away the control as well. So either of you have any thoughts on those points?
There are very specific instances where non-voting shares might be useful. But when you start having different classes of shares in your company, you start introducing complexity to it, because then your constitution needs to address all of these different types of shares. You can have non-voting. You can have what we also call preference shares, which is basically if you own a preference share, the preference shareholder gets paid out in the event of an insolvency prior to the normal shareholders, the ordinary shares. So you can structure contractually different types and classes of shares. It just brings complexity. But one thing that you might want to consider is, why are you asking for non-voting shares? Typically, we find that the success stories when it comes to the startup world is a team effort, right? So the investor that is coming in is not only just bringing in their money, but they're also bringing in their relationships. They're bringing in their network. They're bringing in their particular expertise in an area that you as a founder might not have. And if you only give them non-voting shares, then their voice is not as loud. And also, if you structure the investment so that it's a non-voting share, the investor might balk at it and go, well, why would I want to subscribe and basically give you money without having any ability to input on how this company is run, particularly if it's a large investment? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. Sophie, can you mention just something? I think it'd be good for them to hear or think about governance as well, because that's something that startups, well, what do you think? Is it important or not?
Absolutely. Good governance is so important. It's important to have a good group of people who are making decisions in the best interest of the company. And I'll pop on in the chat. Steven's done a great podcast with the Institute of Directors, interviewing some incredible founders on their thoughts on governance. But it's certainly something that is really important to get right, because these are the people that are steering the ship of the company, if you will, and making some key decisions.
Yeah, I totally agree. Obviously, I'm really biased, but it's a pretty good podcast series. It's really short. It's 10 to 15 minutes. And in this season, the first season, I interviewed 13 people. And then this season, I've interviewed 7 people from different sectors, asking them about governance. So we have a Te Ao Māori perspective. we have an architect, we have an infrastructure person. We've got like real variety of voices. The other thing that I would just mention for startups is it can be a good idea to have, you might call it an advisory board. So that's a wise group of people who are not directors, but who you reach out to and say, hey, I'm facing this issue, like I need to take out this lease and what should I do? Or I'm negotiating this contract to expand to Australia. Any advice for me? So be looking out for people who can be mentors and who can potentially give you advice. A good place to look for those is there's lots of accelerators. So be looking across the country. Ministry of Awesome do a really good job at that. Creative HQ up in Wellington, they do a great job of accelerators. Ice House has various things that they're running. Like, just be looking out in the ecosystem. There's actually a lot going on. So look for programs that you can throw your hat in the ring and be part of, because you're going to learn a lot if you do join one of those. Like, I've seen what they do. I'm a mentor for Creative HQ and Ministry of Awesome. So I come in and give sessions like this, 2 hours on legal structures. And I see the benefit that these people have from participating. But the point is, through that, you might meet someone and be like, hey, could you be on my advisory board? The one caution there is you have to be careful that they don't become what's called shadow directors. So that's, in other words, you're actually taking instructions from them, then they actually become a director. The common scenario around this would be there's a shareholder of a company and the board of directors meets, and the shareholder isn't a director, but they're always at the board meetings. And then you notice that every time there's a decision, the board of directors are on the table, the shareholders over there, they all look over there and like, is there a nod or not? And that person is probably what's called a shadow director. So under the Companies Act, they really are a director. So just good to keep some of those things in mind. Compensation, well, if you've got money to pay people, it's obviously helps them to support you, but it's very common to just rely on the goodwill and have people supporting you. Maybe, as Yang was saying, maybe some shares or something at some point would be a way to reward them if you haven't got actual money. So yeah, this has been really fun. I've enjoyed it, and it's good to get those questions coming through. Oh, we do. Okay, let's run through them. Yeah.
First one is, would a long-term credit agreement with the supplier count as investment with FMA legislation needing to be adhered to?
That's a great question. My initial reaction is that it wouldn't be, because I feel like that's a contract arrangement rather than an investment. The FMA is really worried about what they call an offer of securities or an offer of debt. So it's more like I'm issuing shares or I'm taking a loan rather than I have a contractual arrangement. That's my first reaction. I don't know, do either of you, any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, that's my first reaction as well.
Yeah. Okay, next one.
Another question.
Great.
Could you please provide some examples of how the potential conflict between mission and shareholder benefit might be handled, especially with projects that have some but lower end financial ROI?
Yeah, returns on investment. Yeah, I think so it's a tension. Okay, I'm not saying I have the perfect solution here, but I want you as the founders to be really crystal clear about what your motivations are, because I guarantee you it will pay dividends later if you can know what you set up the company for. For many investors and VCs and others, what are they looking for? They are looking for an ROI. They're looking for shareholder benefit. They want to see a scalable business, which is fine. And you want that too. You don't want to be staying the same. You want to grow. But equally with that, it's just this element of, why did you set it up? Like, do you want to actually have an impact on the world and therefore build that into your pitch as well? I actually think it will strengthen your startup because it will give you a solid foundation. If you look at people, like I put in the chat a link to a podcast I do called Seeds. So I've talked with 378 people, and one of them was Brianne West from Etique. And talking to her, like, a big part of the success of her business has been the very clear mission of reducing plastic bottle consumption. take the bar of soap and then take it in the shower. Don't put it in a plastic bottle. So I think in the future, businesses which are able to articulate the good that they're going to have in the world are going to have a much easier time of raising money, because I think investors are increasingly looking for that as well. Like, it's a win-win. So, yeah.
And just to add to that, the more forthright you are about, your mission, the more clearly you can articulate it within the documentation that governs your company's governance and functioning. So you can put that within the Constitution, and you can put that within the shareholders agreements to lock it in if you want to.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we hope that this has been helpful. Yeah, that's our intention. We just want to open source and make the content more easy to understand. Because I think when you're a startup and you're an entrepreneur, there's a lot of wondering about, well, what are my options? How should I do it? What does it look like? As I said at the start, we're a law firm. We have 80 people. We do property work. We do subdivisions. We do all of that. We have a disputes team. They go to court and they solve problems for people. And our team, I'm really proud of our team. We've got a really aligned group of people. There's about 8 of us, and we're focusing in on startups, on legal structures, on purpose, and on impact. And I think that unique blend, we can also give that charity angle too. So I don't think there's any other law firm in New Zealand that is able to offer what we do. And we're based from Christchurch, from Ōtautahi, but I was in Wellington. I'm in Wellington on Monday. I was in Auckland last week. I'm traveling a lot. So don't let the physical location of where we are be a deterrent. Also, we are very happy to have phone calls and to have informal conversations just to give you pointers on the road. Those are things that we don't charge people for. We fit them in an appropriate moment when we've got the time. And then we're happy to give you some thoughts and guidance on, well, what does it look like going forward? As well as all those guides there, there's the podcasts, and next year we're going to run some more of these sessions. So we'll send an email out with some links and things. And in the future, just be watching out. If there's a topic that you would like us to cover, then we're happy to do that. We have an employment team. They could do something about specific employment questions, or we could talk more about capital raising, or we could talk about terms and conditions of contracts, or non-disclosure agreements, or privacy. Like, the list is kind of endless, really. It keeps going. Lots of things for you to be aware of. So thanks, everyone. Really enjoyed having you be here. I am recording this, and as soon as this finishes, I'm going to save it to YouTube, and then I'm going to send an email to everybody who was on the call so that you can watch it back, or if you choose, you could hit forward and send it on to somebody else that might benefit. So I'll also love to connect on LinkedIn as well for any of you who are into LinkedIn. I'm pretty distinctive name, so I'm easy to find. Thanks everyone for joining. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.